On July 31st, Friday morning, Michelle's not here, so I can say this, I can admit this. I went to the PGA Superstore that they built here in Dallas, or Southlake. I'm not supposed to be there because it's not Dick's Sporting Goods, but she's not here, so I'm okay. And I just was going to scope out the competition and see what they have compared to what Dick's Sporting Goods has. That's what I told her anyway. And they had golf balls on clearance, the golf balls that I use. So I decided to buy a couple dozen. And I was in line at the register, and I was checking out. And I looked behind me, and there was a guy right behind me in line. And I knew him. But I didn't know where I knew him from. That ever happen to you? I see a lot of people from church and from other groups, and it happens occasionally that I see somebody, and I know them, but I don't remember where I know them from. But it was this guy. I was like, I know this guy. It's not like, sometimes you see somebody like, I think I know him, but I'm not going to ask. But I was like, I know this guy. And so I said to him, where do I know you from? And he said, I don't know. Where do you know me from? And I immediately realized who it was just by hearing his voice. It was Jeff Bannister, the manager of the Texas Rangers. And I said, oh, I know who you are. And I introduced myself, and they had just made a deal for a really good pitcher. His name is Cole Hamels. And I said, you guys are going to be really good next year. You have Cole Hamels now, and you're going to have Yu Darvish back from injury, and I think you guys are going to be really good next year. And he said, well, don't count us out for this year. And I thought, yeah, right. At the time, the Rangers were in third place. They were 8 games out of first place. They were closer in the standings to last place than they were to first place. And it's funny because I was driving to actually meet Shirley and Terry Glazer for lunch. I don't know if you remember me telling you the story when we met for lunch. And I said, just met, but man, that guy is just crazy. There's no way the Rangers are going to be good this year. But he believed that they were. He believed. And if you watch the way that he managed the Rangers for the last 2 months, he made decisions assuming that they were a good baseball team. See, my baseball team, the Detroit Tigers, once they thought they weren't going to make, they started playing young guys and seeing what they had, and they just decided that they were going to lose. He decided that they were going to win, and he was going to manage that way. There is great power in believing. And as they hopefully finish out the Blue Jays today, I can't help but think of that time that I met with him and think, there is a lot of power in him standing up there and saying, you guys, we may be 8 games out, but we still have a chance. Power in believing. We are in the midst of a sermon series called Explore God, us and a few hundred of our closest congregational friends in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And today's question is Jesus really God? And I think there's great power in believing that Jesus is really God, but why do we believe that Jesus is really God? Why do I believe that Jesus is really God? And so I want to share a few reasons why I believe that Jesus is really God. As I went through these characteristics about Jesus, I took a poll this week of Taylor and Wendy because they were in the office, and then Tim Draney because we went to lunch. And so I asked them. So I think Jesus was incredibly smart. Jesus was amazingly smart. And so I asked Taylor, Wendy, and Tim who the smartest person they know of is. And they all said Einstein, Albert Einstein. And I think Jesus may have been maybe smarter than that. There's a story in Matthew 22 about a group of Pharisees. People who have spent their entire lives studying the Old Testament, studying the Scriptures, studying the laws of the church. They were the experts, and there was a group of them. And they come to Jesus, a man who was trained to be a carpenter. And they try to trick him. And so they set a trap for him. And they say, Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar? It's a trap, because there is no right answer. If Jesus says, yes, you should pay taxes to Caesar, then they can look at the Jewish people and say, he is pro-Roman. You don't want to follow a guy that's pro-Roman. We are pro-Israel. Follow us. If he says, no, you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, then they can point to him, to the Romans, and say, he's anti-Roman. He's opposed to the Roman movement. He's opposed to your government. He's starting a riot. He's telling people not to pay their taxes. So they set a trap for him. And Jesus says, give me a coin. Whose face is that? Caesar's, they say. He says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And the text says, when they heard that what Jesus said, they were amazed. They left him and went away. He outsmarted an entire group of Pharisees. The text goes on to say the Sadducees, the elite of the elite came next, a group of them, and he outsmarted them as well. Not only did he outsmart them, but if you just read what he had to say, in Matthew 5 through 7, there's this piece called the Sermon on the Mount that starts with the Beatitudes, and Jesus teaches about life. A lot of people have said that the Bible is life's instruction manual or owner's manual. Have you ever heard anybody say this? If you really want to know how to live a good life, if you know Matthew 5 through 7, you have all you need to live a good life. If you took every piece of good advice you've ever heard in your life, just really solid good advice on how to treat one another, you can find it in Matthew 5 through 7. Jesus was brilliant, but not only was he brilliant and smart and intelligent, he was wise. He was wise. So I asked Wendy, Taylor, and Tim who the wisest person you know of are, and got 3 different answers. Taylor said Nelson Mandela, Wendy said Benjamin Franklin, and Tim said Ronald Reagan. Some people who have definitely a reputation of being wise. And so Jesus, wise beyond anyone's understanding. Wise when he teaches people how to behave around their friends. Luke 14 to me, I think, is just a great example of how wise Jesus was. He says, when you show up at a wedding feast, don't assume that you have a seat of honor. Don't assume that you're going to sit at the table with the bride and groom or the bride and groom's parents, but instead take a seat way in the back so that the guest, the person putting on the feast can come up to you and say, friend, why are you sitting way back here? Come and sit with me. Because if you sit in the wrong place, your friend has to come and say, I'm sorry, you can't sit there. Can you move down a few seats? It's just, Jesus is just really wise when he tells us about how to treat one another and how to understand relationships and understand our place in relationships. And he's always careful about making sure that you don't have to be humiliated, or actually making sure that somebody doesn't have to make the difficult decision of asking you to take a place of lower honor. So he was wise, he was smart, and he was really charismatic. Jesus was really charismatic. People just wanted to be around him. People wanted to follow him. When he called his disciples in Mark 1, he just walked down to the beach to where the fishermen were and said, hey, drop your nets and follow me, and I'll make you fish for men. And they dropped their nets, and they left their jobs, and they followed him. People just wanted to follow Jesus. People just wanted to be around him. I asked Taylor, Wendy, and Tim who was charismatic. And Taylor said Pope Francis. And Wendy, I almost fell out of my chair, said Bill Clinton. Tim said Jesus Christ. Good job, Tim. That wasn't allowed? Jesus was charismatic. People wanted to be around him. Jesus was smart. He was wise. But he was compassionate. Jesus was very compassionate. In Matthew 9, it's written, then Jesus went out about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. When he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered like sheep having no shepherd. Tim, Taylor, and Wendy agreed that Mother Teresa is an example of somebody who was compassionate. Now, you may wonder, why do we care what Wendy, Tim, and Taylor think? Because if you look so far at these 4 examples of what Jesus was like, the type of people that Wendy, Tim, and Taylor have come up with are really different from each other, aren't they? Mother Teresa, Bill Clinton, Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, very different people. He was compassionate. He was humble. The text from Isaiah this morning, he was despised, rejected by mankind. There was nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. John 13, Jesus, after his disciples have followed him now for a couple of years, and they're starting to understand who Jesus is, he gets down on his knees and starts washing their feet. He was a servant, and he needed them to understand that as disciples, they too are servants. They are to become humble. And so he washes their feet. Even Peter says, wait a second. You are the Christ. You don't wash my feet. I wash yours, if anything. He says, no, Peter, you don't understand. That's not what this is all about. He was humble. There are a lot of charismatic people. There are a lot of smart people. But it's hard to be charismatic and smart and humble. I asked Taylor and Wendy who they thought was humble. They said Pope Francis, just here in town carrying his own bag. Tim said, Pastor Nick. I love you. I mean, seriously, you are the perfect member. I did buy lunch. Actually, I did. I sure did. Anybody who wants me to buy him lunch, you know what you need to do. He was humble. But he was more than that. Most importantly, obedient to God's word, to God's will, even to the point of dying. Jesus didn't want to die. I don't think that's something we say enough. Jesus didn't want to die on a cross. Matthew 26, verse 39. Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. Jesus did not want to die. Especially did not want to die in a painful, agonizing way like the cross. He was completely obedient to God's will. When I asked Taylor and Wendy, they said that nurses remind them, people who are obedient to God's will. And Tim said, Moses. Good answers. So many different people when we think of these 6 different characteristics. And yet, Jesus was all of them. Jesus was all of them. Smart, wise, charismatic, compassionate, humble, and obedient. He was all these things. And yet he said something like this in the gospel today. I am the bread of life. I am the living bread that comes down from heaven. He was either smart, wise, compassionate, charismatic, humble, and obedient, and absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy. Because anybody who stands up in a group of people and says, I am God, is one of 2 things. Absolutely crazy or God. And so we have to say, well, Jesus, smarter than possibly any human being that's ever been here, incredibly wise, compassionate, charismatic, humble, obedient, didn't use his place of honor for his own gain. Was he crazy? Or was he who he said he was? But all that is reason for me. But the reality is we're not here to worship him because he was smart, wise, charismatic, compassionate, humble, and obedient. We're here to worship him for 2 main reasons. First, because he is risen from the dead. Because he is risen from the dead. If he wasn't risen from the dead, we wouldn't be here. And the second is just as important, and I don't think it's said enough. Because if he was risen from the dead, I would be really impressed with that. But without the second piece, I wouldn't be here today. He promises to share his victory over death with us. Not only is he risen from the dead, he promises you too will have eternal life. You know, I don't know about you, there are a lot of people that I look forward to seeing again. There are a lot of people that I'd like to spend eternity with. And it's only through the grace of God and the gift of Jesus Christ that I'll be able to do that. I can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus is God, but I can promise you that nothing in the world is more powerful than believing that he is. Amen.